Lieutenant James Whittaker stood at his kitchen window, arms crossed over his pristine police uniform as he watched his new housekeeper, Sarah Thompson, walk up the long driveway of his mansion. The morning sun highlighted her simple black dress and practical shoes, attire he had specifically required in the employment contract. At 24, Sarah carried herself with quiet dignity, her nursing textbooks tucked carefully in her worn backpack. The prestigious River Heights neighborhood where James lived rarely saw people like Sarah. His neighbors were all wealthy white families who had inherited their fortunes or earned them through high-powered careers. James took pride in being one of the few who had climbed the ranks of law enforcement to afford such luxury, though he conveniently forgot about his own family wealth that had paved the way. "You're 3 minutes late," James said sharply as Sarah entered through the service door, even though she was actually 2 minutes early according to the ornate grandfather clock in his hallway. "I expect punctuality from my employees." Sarah kept her expression neutral, having learned from her mother how to navigate these situations. "I apologize, sir. There was an accident on Cedar Avenue that slowed traffic." She didn't mention that she had left home an hour early just to ensure she would arrive on time. James watched with barely concealed disdain as Sarah organized her cleaning supplies. Her references had been impeccable. 4 years working for other wealthy families, all putting herself through nursing school. But something about her presence in his home made him uncomfortable, though he would never admit the prejudice behind those feelings. "The list of duties is on the counter," he said coldly. "I expect everything done before I return from my shift. My daughter Emma will be hosting a dinner party this evening for my police department colleagues." He straightened his badge, a reminder of his authority. "Make sure you remain unseen during the event." Sarah glanced at the extensive list, her heart sinking slightly. The tasks would take far longer than her contracted hours, but she knew better than to mention this. The job paid better than most housekeeping positions, and she desperately needed the money for her final year of nursing school. As James left for work, Sarah began her duties methodically. She dusted the expensive artwork, polished the silver, and scrubbed the marble floors until they gleamed. Family photos lined the walls. James with his late wife, his daughter Emma at various ages, and countless images of police award ceremonies. The pictures painted a story of privilege and power. In the kitchen, Sarah overheard Emma talking on the phone while preparing for the dinner party. Unlike her father, Emma's voice carried warmth and kindness. "Dad's impossible sometimes," Emma was saying, "the way he treats the household staff. I tried talking to him about it, but he won't listen." Sarah pretended not to hear, focusing instead on polishing the expensive copper pots. She thought about her own dreams, the long hours of study, the sacrifices her family had made to help her through school, and the promise of a nursing career where she could help others. This job was just a stepping stone, she reminded herself. As evening approached, Sarah had nearly completed the endless list of tasks. Her back ached from hours of cleaning, but she held her head high. Through the window, she saw police cars beginning to arrive for the dinner party. Officers in pressed uniforms stepped out, their wives in expensive dresses trailing behind them. James returned home early to inspect her work, moving through the house with a critical eye. The baseboards in the study still showed dust, he commented, though Sarah had cleaned them twice. "And I can see streaks on the dining room windows." "I'll take care of it right away, sir," Sarah replied quietly, reaching for her cleaning supplies again. She could feel James watching her with that same uncomfortable scrutiny he always had, but she focused on her work. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "Keep your dignity, no matter how others treat you." As Sarah cleaned the windows one final time, she heard the guests arriving, their laughter and conversation floating through the house. She made herself invisible, just as James had demanded, moving silently through the service corridors with practiced ease. In just a few hours, she could go home to her small apartment, to her textbooks and dreams of a different future. Little did either of them know that their lives were about to become entangled in ways neither could have predicted, setting in motion events that would shake the foundations of James's carefully controlled world and test Sarah's resilience in ways she never imagined. 3 months passed since Sarah began working at the Whittaker mansion. The autumn leaves turned golden outside the large windows she cleaned daily, but the atmosphere inside the house grew increasingly tense. Sarah noticed James watching her more frequently, his gaze a mixture of prejudice and something else she couldn't quite identify. One morning, While Sarah organized the kitchen, Emma walked in and found her father criticizing the housekeeper's work yet again. The coffee mugs aren't arranged properly, James snapped, rearranging the cups Sarah had just organized. And why are there fingerprints on the refrigerator? I'm not paying you to do substandard work. Sarah kept her eyes down, wiping the already spotless refrigerator door. She had learned that responding only made things worse. Emma watched the scene with growing frustration, noting how her father's behavior toward Sarah differed from his treatment of their previous housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, who had been white. Later that day, during a small gathering of police officers at the house, Sarah overheard conversations while cleaning nearby rooms. James has been different lately, one officer whispered to another. Ever since he hired that new girl. Did you see how he spoke to her at last week's dinner? Yeah, but nobody wants to say anything. He's the lieutenant, after all, another replied, their voices dropping even lower. Sarah continued working, pretending not to hear. She thought about quitting almost every day, but the pay was helping her stay ahead in her nursing school payments. Her mother had always taught her that education was the key to a better life, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her from achieving that dream. One evening, as Sarah was finishing her duties, James called her into his study. The room smelled of expensive leather and cigars, and awards from his police career lined the walls. Sit down, he ordered, pointing to a chair across from his desk. Sarah sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. James stared at her for a long moment before speaking. There have been items missing from the house, he said, his voice cold. Small things. A silver spoon from the dining room, some cash from Emma's purse. Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. Sir, I haven't taken anything. I would never. I'm not accusing you, James interrupted, though his tone suggested otherwise. I'm simply making you aware that I notice everything that happens in my house. The threat in his words was clear. That night, Sarah cried in her small apartment, feeling trapped and humiliated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. I know you didn't take anything. Dad's wrong about this, and about so many things. The following week, during another police department gathering, Sarah overheard more conversations while serving drinks. Did you see how Whittaker handled that case on Grove Street? One officer murmured. That poor black kid didn't stand a chance. But nobody says anything because, well, you know. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she carried the empty glasses back to the kitchen. She had seen the news about that case, a young man wrongly arrested, though the charges were later dropped. Now she understood more about the man she worked for, and it frightened her. Emma noticed Sarah's discomfort and followed her to the kitchen. I'm sorry about my father, she said quietly. He wasn't always like this. After Mom died, something changed in him. But that's no excuse for how he treats people. Sarah managed a small smile. It's okay, Miss Emma, I can handle it. But things were about to become much more complicated. That evening, as Sarah cleaned James's study, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. A folder of police reports, clearly showing a pattern of racial profiling in arrests. She quickly put the folder back, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Unknown to both Sarah and James, their lives were approaching a turning point. The prejudices, secrets, and unspoken tensions in the Whittaker household were building toward an explosion that would change everything. And Sarah, despite her best efforts to simply do her job and finish her education, would find herself at the center of a storm that had been brewing for years. As she left work that evening, Sarah felt a wave of nausea, a first sign of something that would soon shatter the careful balance she had been trying to maintain in the Whittaker household. The morning Sarah discovered she was pregnant, her world stopped spinning for a moment. Standing in her tiny bathroom, staring at the test results, she felt her carefully planned future beginning to crumble. She knew immediately who the father was. James Whittaker, her employer, from that one night 2 months ago when he had cornered her in his study after a department party, his breath heavy with whiskey. Sarah had never told anyone about that night. She had wanted to quit immediately, but her financial situation and nursing school fees had kept her trapped in the job. Now, as morning sickness made her hands shake while dusting the expensive paintings in the Whittaker mansion, she knew she had to tell him. James was in his study that morning, reviewing police reports when Sarah knocked softly on the door. Enter, he called out, not looking up from his papers. The room still made her uncomfortable, bringing back memories she tried to forget. Mr. Whitaker, Sarah began, her voice trembling slightly. I need to speak with you about something important. She stood straight, trying to maintain her dignity despite her fear. James finally looked up, his face showing irritation at being interrupted. Make it quick. I have a department meeting in an hour. Sir, Sarah took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air like heavy smoke. And you're the father. The change in James's expression was immediate and frightening. His face turned red, then white, as he slowly stood up from his desk. How dared you, he hissed, his voice dangerously low. How dare you come into my house and make such ridiculous accusations? It's the truth, Sarah said firmly, though her heart was racing. That night after the party, when you... Get out, James shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. You're fired. I want you out of my house immediately. If you try to spread these lies, I'll make sure nobody in this town ever hires you again. Who do you think they'll believe? A respected police lieutenant or some lying maid? Emma, hearing the commotion, appeared at the study door. Dad, what's going on? This woman, James spat out the words, is trying to extort money from me with ridiculous claims. Call security and have her removed. Sarah turned to Emma, tears now flowing freely. Emma, please. Don't you dare speak to my daughter. James moved around the desk, his face contorted with rage and fear. Get your things and get out. If you ever try to contact me or my family again, I'll have you arrested for trespassing. Emma watched in shock as Sarah hurried from the room, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She followed Sarah to the kitchen, where the young housekeeper was gathering her few belongings with trembling hands. Sarah, what happened? What did he do? Emma asked quietly, closing the kitchen door behind her. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to tell Emma everything. The shame and fear were too overwhelming. I'm sorry, she whispered, grabbing her backpack. I have to go. As Sarah walked down the long driveway for the last time, she heard James on the phone in his study, his voice carrying through the open window. Johnson? Yes, I need you to put out the word. That Thompson girl is not to be hired by anyone in River Heights. She's a troublemaker, trying to scam honest people. The autumn wind felt cold against Sarah's tear-stained face as she waited for the bus. Her phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Whatever happened, I want to help. Please let me know you're safe. But Sarah couldn't respond. Her dreams of finishing nursing school seemed impossible now. Without this job, she couldn't afford tuition. Without references, she couldn't find another position. And the baby on the way? That evening, as Sarah sat in her small apartment, staring at her nursing textbooks and unpaid bills, she realized that James Whitaker had succeeded in doing what he'd wanted from the beginning, making her feel powerless. But as she placed a protective hand over her stomach, something shifted inside her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. Little did James know that his actions that day would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just his personal crimes, but systemic injustices that had been hidden for years beneath the polished surface of River Heights. Emma Whitaker couldn't sleep that night after Sarah's sudden dismissal. Something about her father's explosive reaction and Sarah's tears didn't add up. She had known Sarah for months. The young woman was honest, hardworking, and determined to become a nurse. Making false accusations for money didn't fit her character at all. The next morning, Emma drove to Sarah's apartment complex on the other side of town. The building was old but well-maintained, nothing like the luxury homes in River Heights. She found Sarah's unit and knocked softly. Sarah opened the door, looking pale and tired. Her eyes widened in surprise. Emma, you shouldn't be here. Your father. I don't care what my father says, Emma interrupted, stepping inside. I need to know what really happened. Dad's behavior yesterday, I've never seen him like that. Sarah sank onto her worn couch, hands trembling as she told Emma everything. About the night after the police department party, about her pregnancy, about James's threats. Emma listened, her face growing darker with each detail. I have copies of text messages, Sarah said quietly, pulling out her phone. Your father sent them after that night, telling me to keep quiet, offering to pay me off. I was too scared to show anyone. Emma read through the messages, feeling sick. This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. How many others has he intimidated into silence? The way he's using his position of power. She looked up, determination in her eyes. We need to stop him. How? Sarah asked. He's already blacklisted me from finding work. No one will hire a housekeeper without references, and I can't finish nursing school without a job. He's made sure I have no options. Emma pulled out her laptop. You have options. I'm a lawyer, remember? Dad made sure I got the best education money could buy. Now I'm going to use it against him. Her fingers flew over the keyboard. First, we document everything. Then, we contact Maria Torres. The civil rights attorney? Sarah asked. Yes, she's been investigating cases of police misconduct in River Heights for years, but no one's been willing to come forward. Emma paused. And I think I know others who might speak up now. Over the next few days, Emma worked tirelessly. She contacted former housekeepers who had quit suddenly or been fired by her father. Many were too afraid to talk, but 3 agreed to provide statements about James's discriminatory behavior and inappropriate conduct. Maria Torres took the case immediately. This isn't just about wrongful termination, she explained during their first meeting. This is about abuse of power, discrimination, and creating a hostile work environment. The pregnancy adds another layer. He can't fire you for being pregnant, regardless of the circumstances. Word spread quickly through River Heights. James's colleagues at the police department started distancing themselves, especially after Emma provided evidence of his pattern of behavior. Some officers, tired of staying silent, came forward with their own stories of witnessing discrimination. One evening, as Sarah was reviewing documents with Emma and Maria, there was a knock at her door. It was Mrs. Peterson, James's former housekeeper. I should have spoken up sooner, the older woman said, sitting down heavily. I saw how he treated the staff of color differently. I heard the things he said when he thought no one was listening. I kept quiet because I needed the job, but I can't stay silent anymore. Maria added Mrs. Peterson's statement to the growing file. The case was becoming bigger than anyone had anticipated, shining a light on years of unchecked discrimination in River Heights. Sarah touched her stomach gently, now showing slightly under her loose shirt. I'm scared, she admitted to Emma. Your father has so much power in this town. Had power? Emma corrected. The power built on fear and prejudice can't last forever. Change is coming to River Heights, starting with James Whittaker. As they gathered more evidence and testimonies, none of them realized that the biggest revelations were yet to come. James Whittaker's carefully constructed world of privilege and prejudice was about to crumble, and the ripple effects would reach far beyond one wealthy police lieutenant and his former housekeeper. The town of River Heights was about to learn that justice, though delayed, could not be denied forever. The internal affairs investigation into Lieutenant James Whittaker began on a cold Monday morning. The police department's lobby buzzed with whispers as IA investigators carried boxes of files from his office. James sat rigid in his chair, watching his carefully built reputation begin to unravel. Detective Marcus Rodriguez led the investigation, reviewing years of arrest records, civilian complaints, and department memos. The evidence painted a disturbing picture. Lieutenant, he said during the first interview, we found a pattern of discriminatory behavior in your arrests and hiring practices stretching back nearly a decade. James' expensive lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside him. The numbers were impossible to ignore. Minority suspects arrested at higher rates, excessive force complaints swept under the rug, and a notable absence of officers of color under his command. Meanwhile, Sarah's case had caught the attention of local media. Channel 7 News ran a special report. Prominent police lieutenant faces multiple discrimination allegations. The story featured interviews with former employees and officers who had worked under James, each sharing similar stories of prejudice and intimidation. Emma watched her father's world collapse from her office at the law firm. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Childhood friends asking for explanations, colleagues expressing support, and reporters seeking comments. She ignored them all, focusing instead on helping Maria Torres build an airtight case. Your father's personnel file shows 15 complaints of racial bias in the past 5 years, Maria had explained during a strategy meeting. All dismissed without proper investigation. But now, with Sarah's case and these new witnesses coming forward, we can't be ignored. Sarah, now 4 months pregnant, sat in on these meetings, taking careful notes. Her morning sickness had finally subsided, but the stress of the situation took its toll. The only bright spot was that 3 local hospitals had contacted her about nursing positions after graduation, impressed by her courage in coming forward. One afternoon, Officer Chen, a young Asian American policeman who had worked under James, visited Maria's office. "Lieutenant Whittaker blocked my promotion twice," he revealed. "Said I wasn't ready, but promoted 3 white officers with less experience. I have the documentation to prove it." The evidence continued mounting. James's secretary provided emails showing his deliberate efforts to discourage minority applicants. A former detective shared recordings of racist comments made during staff meetings. Each new revelation strengthened Sarah's case and deepened the internal affairs investigation. James's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was spotted late one night shredding documents in his office until security stopped him. During a department meeting, he erupted in anger when someone mentioned Sarah's name, knocking over a chair and having to be escorted out. "Your father's not handling this well," Emma told her mother's portrait one evening in their family home. "But Mom would be proud of what we're doing. She always taught me to stand up for what's right." The turning point came when Detective Rodriguez discovered a hidden folder in James's office computer. It contained years of manipulated arrest statistics, deliberately skewed to justify targeting minority neighborhoods. The revelation made headlines across the state. Sarah watched the news coverage from her small apartment, one hand resting on her growing belly. "Your grandfather will have to face the truth now," she whispered to her unborn child. "Sometimes justice takes time, but it comes eventually." The police chief called a press conference to address the mounting scandal. "The River Heights Police Department is committed to serving all citizens equally," he announced. "We take these allegations seriously and will take appropriate action based on the investigation's findings." James's colleagues, who had once laughed at his racist jokes and ignored his discriminatory practices, now avoided eye contact in the hallways. The same power structure that had protected him for years was crumbling under the weight of evidence and public scrutiny. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Maria Torres prepared for the next phase. "They'll try to settle quietly," she told Sarah and Emma. "But this isn't just about money anymore. This is about changing a system that protected men like James Whittaker for far too long." The story of the wealthy police lieutenant and the pregnant housekeeper had become something bigger, a catalyst for examining long-ignored injustices in River Heights. And as winter settled over the town, everyone waited for the final revelations that would change their community forever. The suspension notice arrived on James Whittaker's desk on a snowy December morning. He stared at the official letter, his hands shaking with rage. "Suspended without pay pending further investigation." The words he delivered to countless others, but never imagined would apply to him. Across town, in the courthouse, Maria Torres presented Sarah's civil lawsuit against James and the police department. The courtroom was packed with reporters, former employees, and citizens of River Heights, all watching as years of discrimination and abuse were finally exposed in public. "Your Honor," Maria addressed Judge Thompson, "we have documented evidence of wrongful termination, workplace discrimination, and retaliation against Ms. Thompson. But this case represents more than one incident. It reveals a pattern of systemic abuse of power." Sarah sat quietly behind her lawyer, now 6 months pregnant. She wore a simple blue dress, her head held high despite the whispers and stares. Emma sat beside her, offering silent support as Maria presented their evidence. The police department's lawyer tried to paint James as a dedicated officer who had served the community for decades. But the evidence was overwhelming. Text messages, emails, witness testimonies, and personnel records told a different story. Officer Chen took the stand, describing how James had blocked his career advancement. "He told me River Heights wasn't ready for an Asian American sergeant," Chen testified. "When I filed the complaint, I was reassigned to night shifts." Mrs. Peterson testified next, her voice steady as she described years of witnessing discriminatory treatment. The lieutenant had different rules for different housekeepers, depending on their race. The things he said when he thought no one important was listening. Outside the courthouse, James' wealthy neighbors began distancing themselves. Party invitations stopped arriving. His country club membership was quietly revoked. The same social circles that had overlooked his behavior for years now shunned him completely. During a lunch break, Emma overheard 2 police officers talking in the courthouse hallway. "Can't believe we never said anything," one muttered. We all knew what was happening. Easier to stay quiet, the other replied. But maybe that's why things never change. The civil lawsuit proceedings continued for days. Maria presented financial records showing how James had systematically underpaid minority employees. Former officers testified about discriminatory patrol assignments and arrest quotas in minority neighborhoods. James's lawyer tried to discredit Sarah, suggesting she was making false accusations for money. But when Sarah took the stand, her quiet dignity and detailed documentation left no room for doubt. I didn't want any of this, Sarah testified, her voice clear and strong. I just wanted to work, finish nursing school, and build a better life. But Mr. Whittaker made it clear that people like me didn't deserve those dreams. The turning point came when Emma testified against her own father. James sat rigid in his chair as his daughter described years of witnessing his prejudiced behavior. I regret staying silent for so long, Emma said, looking directly at her father. But I can't be quiet anymore. That evening, James returned to his empty mansion. Many of his expensive paintings and artifacts had been sold to pay legal fees. His phone rarely rang now. Former friends and colleagues had vanished. In his study, he stared at his police awards and family photos, remnants of a life built on privilege and prejudice. The civil lawsuit concluded with a substantial settlement for Sarah. More importantly, it mandated comprehensive reforms in the police department's hiring, promotion, and oversight practices. The Internal Affairs investigation recommended James's termination, ending his law enforcement career in disgrace. Local newspapers ran editorials examining how one man's prejudice had been enabled by collective silence. Community leaders called for town hall meetings to discuss systemic racism and accountability. Sarah used part of her settlement to pay off her nursing school loans. Your grandfather's actions had consequences, she told her unborn child, rubbing her belly gently. But they'd also helped bring change. As winter deepened in River Heights, the wealthy police lieutenant who had once wielded so much power sat alone in his study, finally facing the price of his prejudice. But for Sarah, Emma, and their allies, this ending was just the beginning of bigger changes to come. Spring arrived in River Heights, bringing changes as dramatic as the seasonal transformation. The police department underwent mandatory bias training, with officers attending weekly sessions led by diversity experts. The dated portraits of all-white police chiefs lining the station walls were joined by a new mission statement emphasizing equality and justice for all. Sarah, now 8 months pregnant, waddled through her final nursing school classes. Her classmates had become protective of her, especially after her case made headlines. Professor Martinez pulled her aside after class one day. The hospital board reviewed your application for the residency program, she said, smiling warmly. They were impressed not just by your grades, but by your courage in standing up to injustice. You start in September. Across town, the police station buzzed with activity as new policies were implemented. Captain Rodriguez, recently promoted after James's departure, supervised the changes. Every arrest report now requires body camera footage, he explained to his officers. And our hiring committee must include diverse representatives from the community. Emma threw herself into reforming the department's legal practices. Her law firm created a special division focused on civil rights cases, with Emma leading the team. She worked late into the night, reviewing old cases where her father's prejudice might have influenced arrests or prosecutions. One evening, while organizing case files, Emma found a photo of her mother at a civil rights march decades ago. She remembered her mother's words. "Privilege comes with responsibility, Emma. We must use our advantages to help others." Finally, she felt she was living up to that legacy. The River Heights Community Council held its first ever town hall on race relations. The meeting room was packed, with people standing along the walls. Sarah, her pregnancy now very visible, sat in the front row as community members shared their experiences. "For years, we were afraid to drive through certain neighborhoods," one resident said. "Not because of criminals, but because of police harassment. That's starting to change." Others spoke about job discrimination, housing inequality, and the subtle prejudices they face daily. The council recorded every testimony, using them to draft new anti-discrimination ordinances for the town. James Whittaker, meanwhile, had retreated to a small condo after selling his mansion to pay legal settlements. His police pension was gone, his reputation ruined. Sometimes he drove past his old house, now owned by a successful African-American surgeon and his family. Sarah's due date approached as summer neared. Emma helped her set up a small nursery in her apartment, painting the walls a cheerful yellow. "This baby," Emma said, hanging tiny clothes in the closet, "will grow up in a different River Heights than the one we knew." The hospital where Sarah would work implemented new diversity initiatives inspired by her story. They created scholarships for minority nursing students and revised their hiring practices. Sarah was invited to join the diversity committee, her perspective valued and respected. One warm evening, Sarah sat in her favorite park, watching children play. A group of rookie police officers jogged past, the training group notably diverse. Officer Chen, now promoted to sergeant, led them in their evening exercise. "The change is happening," Maria Torres said, joining Sarah on the bench. "Slowly, but it's real. Your case opened doors that were locked for generations." The local newspaper ran a special series titled River Heights, a community in transformation. It featured interviews with minority business owners, new police recruits, and community leaders working for change. Sarah's story was highlighted as the catalyst that exposed long-hidden problems. In the police station, the newly formed Community Oversight Board held its first meeting. Citizens from all backgrounds sat alongside officers, reviewing policies and complaints together. The walls now displayed artwork from local schools, showing children's visions of a fair and just community. As Sarah left her final nursing class, her classmates surprised her with a baby shower. Among the gifts was a children's book about courage and standing up for what's right. The inscription read, "For the baby who helped change River Heights before even being born." That night, Sarah felt her baby kick as she reviewed her hospital orientation materials. "You're coming into a world that's trying to be better," she whispered, patting her belly. "Sometimes it takes one small push to start an avalanche of change." The transformation of River Heights continued, proving that even the most deeply rooted prejudices could be challenged and overcome. And somewhere in his small condo, James Whittaker watched the news of these changes, finally beginning to understand the true cost of the privilege he had so long taken for granted. 1 year later, Sarah stood in her crisp white uniform, pinning her RN badge to her pocket. Her son, Michael, now 8 months old, watched from Emma's arms as his mother prepared for her first day as a registered nurse at River Heights Memorial Hospital. "You look perfect," Emma said, bouncing Michael gently. The baby had his mother's warm brown eyes and bright smile, bringing joy to everyone who met him. Hard to believe how much has changed in just 1 year. Sarah glanced around her new apartment, paid for with her nurse's salary. Gone were the days of struggling to make ends meet. Her nursing diploma hung proudly on the wall beside a framed newspaper article titled River Heights, 1 year after the Whittaker case. At the police station, the changes were evident everywhere. The new chief, an African-American woman named Janet Marshall, had transformed the department. The walls displayed community outreach photos showing officers working with citizens of all backgrounds. Officer Chen, now a lieutenant, led the department's recruitment program. James Whittaker rarely showed his face in public anymore. His attempts to find work in other police departments had failed as his story followed him. He spent his days in his small condo, watching through his window as the town he once controlled moved forward without him. Emma's civil rights law practice had grown significantly. She established the Thompson-Whittaker Foundation, named to acknowledge both the catalyst for change and her own family's role in the past injustices. The foundation provided scholarships to minority students pursuing careers in healthcare and law enforcement. The foundation just approved 10 new scholarships, Emma told Sarah as they walked Michael to daycare. The daycare center, once known for its selective admissions, now proudly served families from all backgrounds. 2 of them are going to nursing students, just like you were. Sarah stopped to straighten Michael's tiny jacket. "Sometimes I look at him and think about how different his world will be," she said softly. "They'll never know the River Heights we knew." That evening, the town held a celebration marking 1 year since the implementation of its comprehensive anti-discrimination policies. The park was filled with families from all parts of town, sharing food and stories. Children played together on the playground, oblivious to the barriers that had once divided their parents. Maria Torres gave a speech, standing on the same steps where protests had once been held. "One person's courage," she said, Looking at Sarah in the crowd can light the way for thousands, but it takes an entire community to keep that light burning. Sarah was asked to speak as well. Holding Michael, she addressed the gathering. A year ago, I thought my dreams were over, but instead, they became part of something bigger. River Heights is showing that change is possible when we face the truth and work together. The hospital where Sarah worked had become a model for diversity in healthcare. Her supervisor often asked her to speak to new employees about inclusion and respect. Sarah's quiet strength and professionalism had earned her the respect of colleagues and patients alike. Later that night, as Sarah put Michael to bed, she received a letter. It was from James Whittaker, the first contact since the case ended. With trembling hands, she opened it. Sarah, I've had a year to think about my actions and their consequences. No apology can undo what I did, but I want you to know that I finally understand. Watching our town change has opened my eyes to the prejudices I carried for so long. You and Emma showed more courage than I ever did in my police career. Take care of my grandson. Help him become a better man than his grandfather. James. Sarah shared the letter with Emma over coffee the next morning. Do you think he really changed? She asked. Emma considered the question. Maybe. But what matters more is that we changed. River Heights changed, and Michael will grow up in a town that's still changing. As Sarah headed to her nursing shift that afternoon, she passed the police station. New recruits of various backgrounds were gathering for training. The town hall flew banners promoting unity and equality. Shop windows displayed signs welcoming everyone. Michael would grow up knowing a different River Heights, one where his mother was respected as a healthcare professional, where his aunt fought for justice, and where the color of his skin wouldn't determine his opportunities. The price of prejudice had been high, but the rewards of change were proving even greater. And as Sarah began her shift at the hospital, caring for patients of all backgrounds, she knew that sometimes the greatest victories come from the hardest battles. The end.